Hi, Laura.
Hello, Eva.
We're back because there was an unexpected statement in the Commons chamber just now.
There was, from Keir Starmer on defence spending. So the government had pledged to increase defence spending to 2.5% when they entered office in July, but there was no timeline on when they were going to do that or how they were going to achieve that. What Starmer has stood up and said in the Commons is that they're going to decrease the UK's overseas aid spending, which is currently at 0.5%. They're going to decrease it to 0.3%, and they're going to directly give that to the military budget, which is 2.3% currently, and they're going to increase that to 2.5%
by 2027. Should we listen to the clip?
Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear. The nature of warfare has changed significantly. That is clear from the battlefield in Ukraine. And so we must modernise and reform our capabilities as we invest. I equally want to be very clear that, like any other investment we make, we must seek value for money. And that's why we're putting in place a new defence reform and efficiency plan, jointly led by my right honourable friends, the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary. Yeah. This investment means that the UK will strengthen its position as a leader in NATO and in the collective defence of our continent. And we should welcome that role. It is good for our national security. It is also good for the defining mission of this government to restore growth to our economy. And we should be optimistic of what it can deliver in those terms. But, Mr. Speaker, in the short term, it can only be funded through hard choices. And in this case, that means we will cut our spending on development assistance, moving from 0.5% of GNI today to 0.3% in 2027, fully funding our increased investment in defence. I want to be clear to the House. That is not an announcement I am happy to make. I'm proud of our pioneering record on overseas development, and we will continue to play a key humanitarian role in Sudan, in Ukraine and in Gaza, tackling climate change, supporting multinational efforts on global health and challenges like vaccination. In recent years, the development budget was redirected towards asylum backlogs, paying for hotels. So as we're clearing that backlog at a record pace, there are efficiencies that will reduce the need to cut spending on our overseas programmes. But nonetheless, it remains a cut, and I will not pretend otherwise.
That's the Prime Minister just now. So he's got this meeting with Donald Trump tomorrow, and Trump has been very, where are we? Tuesday. So he's got it on Thursday. Donald Trump has been very strict about how much he believes EU countries and the UK should be spending on defence. He doesn't believe that we're contributing enough in compared to the American military might. So ahead of this meeting, Keir Starmer, I suppose, he'd like to arrive with a timeline. And the way that they have done this is to cut aid spending, which has obviously worried a number of charities who've been speaking in the last hour or so. Save the Children were particularly worried. They said, we are stunned by this decision to cut the aid budget in order to increase military spending. It's a betrayal of the world's most vulnerable people and the UK's national interest. And then we also had a statement from Bond, which is the UK network for organisations in international development. They said that it's a reckless decision that will have devastating consequences for millions of marginalised people worldwide. Mm-hmm. But I tell you who is pleased, Laura?
Kemi Badenoch.
Should we hear?
Yes.
It's now 3 years since Putin's invasion, and the Conservative Party stands resolutely with the people of Ukraine. Our hearts are with those still caught up in this conflict as we remember the many innocent lives lost. I will always be proud of the support the last Conservative government gave in the run-up to Putin's invasion and those first crucial weeks and months of the war. We helped prevent Kiev falling, and we supported Ukraine in regaining territory initially lost to Russia. But it is also true that overall, the West has not done enough to support Ukraine. As has been the case from the outset, it remains ultimately for Ukraine as a proud and sovereign nation that has sacrificed so much to defend itself and the fundamental freedoms that we all hold dear. It is up to them to decide their future. So we want this terrible war to end, but Ukraine needs to be at the negotiating table. And like President Zelensky, we hope for a lasting, reliable peace. But the West must continue to be intensely robust in the face of Putin's aggression. The lesson of the last 20 years is clear. He only comes back for more. The first duty of every government is to protect its people. That means a strong state that stands up for our national interest. Our foreign policy should seek to support our national interest. National interest should always come first. So I'm very pleased to hear the Prime Minister announce that increase to 2.5% by 2027. All of us on this side of the House welcome that. We've all wanted to see more spending on defence. I would ask the Prime Minister, on including the intelligence budget, can he confirm that this is new money for the intelligence services? And does this mean that there will be new money in the next financial year? The Prime Minister will know that I wrote to him at the weekend with suggestions on what we could do to help with increasing defence spending, so I welcome his announcement on repurposing money from the overseas development budget. That is absolutely right. And I look forward to him taking up my other suggestion of looking at what we can do on welfare. He will know that we had a fully funded plan and we urge him to take it up.
What did you make of what Kemi had to say?
I like that everything has to come with a criticism, right? So the Conservatives have been pushing for a long time, mainly thrust by former MPs Ben Wallace and Grant Shapps for increased defence spending. They wanted to see us get to 2.5% quicker than the Labour government were currently planning for. We were waiting on this strategic, what is it, an inquest?
Defence review.
There you go, perfect. And that was going to set out when the Labour government would deliver this 2.5% target. That was supposed to come into the Commons for July, and we're ahead of schedule now. It's happening now.
I mean, there's an irony from Kemi Badenoch there, because it was under the Conservatives that spending on the armed forces flatlined. And I think there are still questions over if the 0.2% increase to military spending will make that much of a difference, because there's, for example, a black hole of 17 billion in the Army's equipment budget already. And Keir Starmer pledged to increase that spending to 3% by the next Parliament as well. Interestingly, the other question that it leaves is which parts of the US, of the UK aid budget, will that money be taken from? They haven't specifically said what will lose its funding. We know right now that hundreds of millions of pounds a year are given to relief efforts in the West Bank and Gaza. We also know that a quarter of all of the UK's overseas aid budget is actually spent at home, housing asylum seekers and refugees in the UK.
One thing that's extraordinary as well is at a time of a climate crisis where experts are repeatedly warning that you are going to see a massive movement of people. You're already seeing it in places like Libya, a lot of people moving to either town centres because they're no longer able to do agricultural work because it's too hot, it's too dry. You're going to see a shift of people into other countries. And at the same time, if you're a government that is very concerned by immigration, I don't understand how in tandem with that you can cut aid spending.
I mean, Starmer was trailing this line, peace through strength, which is very realpolitik, I guess, especially if the US is, as it is kind of doing, undercutting NATO. It does seem to make sense for European countries to up their own defence spending, which is what Trump wants, but it doesn't seem to make sense, like you're saying, to do it from the UK's overseas aid budget. Because
we did hear last week, or it might have been about 10 days ago now, we did hear that departments who weren't exempt, like the Department for Education would have been exempt from this, but they would have had to find 11% in departmental cuts pretty quickly. They were told to draw up plans of how they could find this cash in order to fund more defence spending. That went down like a cup of cold sick because we have already been living in austerity now for 15 years, and there has been no uptick in expenditure since then, especially not if you compare it to real terms cuts because of inflation or to allow for inflation. So it's just rather extraordinary that the decision was made today, which seems very rapid. I see that Annalise Dodds, who's the development minister, was not actually told about this plan until late on Friday, which is rather extraordinary. Mm-hmm. You would have thought the development minister would have been in on those plans. It's interesting that it's going to come from the aid budget specifically, because Keir Starmer was vehemently opposed to this when the Conservatives first cut the budget from 0.7% to 0.5% in 2021. So should we listen to that clip now?
Yes.
The case that we make is this. First, that the cut is wrong because investing in 0.7% in international aid is in Britain's national interest. This has been a cross-party position for 20 years. Successive prime ministers have kept to the commitment. Every living prime minister thinks this is wrong. There's only one prime minister who's prepared to do this, and he's sitting there.
Yeah, that 0.7% was the UN aid targets. But then the Conservatives during the pandemic cut it to 0.5%. They said as a temporary measure, but clearly that's not the case. And
Keir Starmer promised that a Labour government would re-up that back to 0.7%. He also said at the time that he was voting against the motion in line with Theresa May, who was still a backbench MP, then obviously former Prime Minister. And he said that every Prime Minister alive would not agree with the motion that Boris Johnson was putting down. And it's extraordinary because where on earth is David Lammy in all of this? David Lammy has been one of the most outspoken critics of cutting the foreign aid budget, and he's absolutely nowhere to be seen. I mean, where have they put him? In a room? Have they locked him away?
Is he even in Parliament today?
Where is he? He was there because he was answering questions this morning, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, it would have been useful for him to be.
It would have been useful for him to be there. But he was vocal, actually, David Lammy, earlier this month when Donald Trump announced that there would be a 90-day freeze on all US international aid spending. He was very a vocal critic, and he said that this would be a big strategic mistake that allowed China to further its global influence. So then for your own party to cut aid, and when that decision was first announced, there was shock and there was horror because, the sort of the ramifications of this it's sort of things like pandemic prevention, that part of the US Department now gets cut. It's things like providing condoms in areas where you might, people need access to them. It's huge. It's a huge cut and it will have catastrophic effects.
I think when we live in such a globalized, interconnected world, I think a lot of people close their eyes to the fact that when something happens in a country over there, actually, because of how interconnected we are, it can only be minutes before it has ramifications for us too. We don't exist separately from one another. So it makes sense, like you were saying, especially in the case of things like pandemic preparedness, that we work together globally on these issues.
It really does. So I find it dumbfounding. I don't think I quite have the words yet or the analysis on cutting the aid budget and what that will mean, because it's not just about where would we have found this money elsewhere if we weren't going to cut it from this budget. It's a morality point. Britain has always been, for all of its atrocities, has always been a country that has sought to do good elsewhere. It has sought to help in, I'm going to say things and people are going to be really awful in the comments, but that it has sought to help in Gaza. There are pressure groups that have pushed the government into continuing to spend aid there. For that money to now be retracted and instead just go on weapons, I think that's a sort of watershed moment for the country, at least in its recent history.
How much do you think of this is to do with what's happened between, or the statements that are coming out of Russia recently versus an attempt to get on side with America, if that question makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I think, it's absolutely an announcement that is, it's right before his meeting with Trump. And it's what's interesting is how Trump has managed to get into office and reset the world order in a matter of days. You've got Zelensky saying that he will step down if it will lead to peace. You've got parts of Europe acquiescing to each other, actually, because you've got the incoming chancellor, or we assume he will be the incoming chancellor, Friedrich Merz, saying that we've got to live in a world now without the protection of America, and we've got to get used to that. And now you've got Britain cutting its aid budget in order to ramp up its defence spending. This has just been a massive domino effect. And what's fascinating about it is it's all come off of a couple of words that Donald Trump has said that have been rather scrambled and rather confused. It's not exactly like he gave a direct edict and told everyone you have to do this.
I mean, it's clearly not thought through, because they seem to be, living through a government of social media and Twitter announcements. But the ramifications, like you said, for Europe are massive. And if anything, give more of an impetus for increased European integration, especially between Germany, the UK and France. If we're looking at who we should align our strategic and foreign policy with, who we have a common interest with and who wants to work with us, it's Europe. It's not America anymore.
But how popular will this be? I can't imagine people will want to see the aid budget cut in order to fund extra bombs.
Especially not Labour voters as well.
It's really, I just don't think that's where people are. Have we talked about Kemi Badenoch? Did we tee her up?
We did tee her up.
We did tee her up, because one thing I actually did want to note was this announcement, I would say, I'm going to assume took her by surprise. I actually don't have time to check if it did or not. But I assume it did, because she did look a little bit deer in headlights at the dispatch box this afternoon. She had been giving a speech at the Policy Exchange earlier today, in which she said, she was asked a question by a journalist about whether we should be leaving the ECHR. And she said, yeah, I think we should actually. And what was interesting about that, it's not that we've ever, we've heard that before. But she'd been making this argument about a rules-based global agenda. And she was, rules-based global order. And she was arguing that, we need to have more presence on the world stage, and we need to go back to Britain's roots, and we need to, really start thinking about our soft and hard power. And then she's like, the ECHR, yeah, we should probably leave it. Just so incongruent.
If you're looking for soft power as well, one of the key ways to do that is through aid spending. So surely she would be against the aid spending cut.
Yeah.
If she had, if she
or cutting the BBC. She loves doing that as well. She's pro cutting the BBC, which is a really important, important bureaus that we have in countries across the world.
Maybe she's just not sure what soft power is.
Yeah. Anyway, I think she was a bit late to the Policy Exchange speech, because they started 10 minutes late.
Did they actually?
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is, what are they calling it? Kemi Mean Time.
Yes. If you haven't seen this story, it's that Kemi is running very late to lots of meetings, especially in Westminster, and some of her SPADs have dubbed her as having KMT, Kemi Mean Time. So
we've been a bit short and sweet there. This was just sort of a reaction bit. We'll do more of it tomorrow. We will talk more. Maybe it would be interesting if we come back with an expert and they can ask some questions.
That would be good.
Okay. Put your questions below or on the Reddit. Bye.
Bye.